The company's grand announcement hall was buzzing with excitement. Employees whispered amongst themselves, speculating about the changes that might come with the new leadership. Some were hopeful, others nervous, but everyone was eager to see the man who would be taking over the empire his father had built from the ground up. The atmosphere was charged, a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Then, the doors swung open, and he walked in. My boss's son. He strolled onto the stage like he owned not just the company, but the entire world. His expensive suit was tailored to perfection, his hair slicked back with precision, and the arrogance in his smirk was impossible to ignore. He scanned the room, eyes gleaming with a sense of power he clearly didn't earn. Employees clapped hesitantly, unsure whether they were welcoming a leader or a tyrant. I had worked in this company for years, dedicating my time, effort, and loyalty to its growth. I had been through its struggles, contributed to its success, and earned the respect of my colleagues. But none of that mattered to him. His gaze landed on me, and I immediately felt the shift in the energy of the room. He tilted his head slightly, his smirk deepening as if he had been waiting for this very moment. With a fake, almost theatrical sigh, he shook his head. Well, he mused, his voice dripping with condescension. It seems this company has been carrying some unnecessary weight for far too long. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, people exchanging nervous glances. Then, in a swift, almost effortless motion, he pulled out a document and held it up for everyone to see. My name was printed boldly across the top. I believe in making swift decisions, he continued, his voice filled with cruel amusement. And my first executive order as the new CEO is to get rid of dead weight. He extended his arm, handing me the termination letter with a satisfied grin. We don't need old liabilities like you. A hushed silence fell over the room. Gasps could be heard, some employees covering their mouths in shock. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. The sheer humiliation of being fired so publicly should have crushed me. But I didn't flinch. I didn't beg. I didn't even argue. Instead, I took the letter from his hand, my expression unreadable. Then, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of submission. It wasn't even a forced smile. It was a knowing smile, one that unsettled him for a brief second. He expected me to break down, to plead for my position, but I gave him nothing. I simply turned on my heel and walked away, leaving behind a room full of stunned employees. But as I walked out of that hall, one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. As I stepped out of the office building, a cold gust of wind hit my face, but the chill I felt wasn't from the weather. It was from the realization that everything I had worked for, years of dedication, countless hours spent perfecting my craft, my unwavering loyalty to this company, had been thrown away in an instant. Not because of my performance. Not because I wasn't valuable. But because of one man's arrogance. My hands clenched around the termination letter, my mind racing with emotions. Anger. Betrayal. Humiliation. But above all, a burning resolve. I wasn't helpless. No, far from it. If the boss's son thought he had won, he was about to realize how deeply mistaken he was. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a moment. And then, like a lightning bolt, it hit me. This company wasn't his. Sure, he had inherited it. He had walked in with an expensive suit, a privileged smirk, and a false sense of authority. But the foundation of this empire? It wasn't built by him. It was built by his father, my old boss. The man who had spent years constructing this business from scratch, the man who had trusted me, mentored me, and once told me, loyalty and intelligence are a company's greatest assets. The boss's son had neither. He had stepped into his father's shoes without understanding the ground beneath him. He had never faced the struggles, never learned the sacrifices that came with running a business. He was merely riding on his father's success, blind to the fact that real power wasn't inherited, it was earned. And that's when I remembered. The contract. A smirk tugged at my lips as I recalled the fine print, the hidden clause that no one else had bothered to read. No one, except me. Years ago, when my old boss had offered me a senior position, he had added a unique clause to my contract. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, it was just another line in a sea of legal jargon. But now? Now it was the very thing that would change everything. I reached into my bag, pulling out my own copy of the contract. My eyes scanned the page until I found it. And there it was, clear as day. A clause that gave me a level of power the new boss had no idea about. My heart pounded in my chest as realization set in. He had fired me in front of everyone. Humiliated me without even reading the one document that could turn his world upside down. He thought he had removed me from his company. He had no idea that with one move, I could remove him from his own empire. And by the time he realized it, it would already be too late. The next morning, in the grand conference hall of the company, a tense atmosphere gripped the room. The board members sat in their chairs, eyes flickering with uncertainty, while the new boss, who had confidently fired me just a day ago, sat at the head of the table, still basking in his imagined victory. He had no idea what was coming. Then, the heavy wooden doors burst open. The sound echoed across the room, and every head turned toward the entrance. It was his father. The real boss. The man who had built this company from the ground up. And right now, he was furious. His usually composed face was contorted with rage, his fists clenched as he stomped into the room. "You did what?" His voice boomed across the hall. The new boss, his son, visibly flinched. "Dad, Shut up." His father slammed a thick stack of papers onto the table, making everyone jump. His face was red with anger. "Did you even read the contract before you fired her?" Silence. The smirk that the new boss had worn so proudly yesterday was gone. His hands trembled as he reached for the documents. He flipped through the pages, his eyes darting back and forth. And then, his face went pale. His jaw slackened, his breath hitched, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He turned page after page, as if desperately hoping that what he was reading was some sort of mistake. But it wasn't. His downfall had begun. The board members exchanged confused glances, whispering among themselves. The father turned to them, his voice cold and cutting. "Gentlemen, let me explain what my foolish son has done." He inhaled sharply, his disgust clear. He just fired the one person who had a contractual safeguard in place, a safeguard that gives her the right to claim a significant portion of the company's shares if she's dismissed without just cause. A wave of murmurs rippled across the room. The board members' eyes widened, their interest now piqued. "Wait, shares?" one of them asked. "Not just a few shares," his father clarified, rubbing his temples as if trying to contain his rage. "A majority stake if she's wrongfully terminated. This company's ownership is now at stake." The new boss looked like he might pass out. His hands gripped the table, his knuckles turning white. "Dad, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know," his father roared. "Because you didn't read. Because you walked in here like an entitled little prince and thought you could do whatever you wanted." I had been silent all this time, standing at the doorway, watching. But now, it was time. I stepped forward. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. The new boss flinched as if he had seen a ghost. I smiled, calm, collected, in complete control. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice smooth and steady. I placed my own copy of the contract on the table, flipping straight to the hidden clause. I tapped my finger on the crucial paragraph, letting them all see what had been ignored. "As you can see," I continued, "by firing me without just cause, the company has triggered this clause, granting me the right to claim the shares." The board members leaned in, reading the fine print. Their eyes widened. One of them whispered, "My God, it's true." The new boss looked up at me, his face ashen. He opened his mouth to speak but no words came out. He had laughed when he fired me. Now, he wasn't laughing anymore. The moment I submitted my legal claim, the news spread like wildfire. 30% of the company's shares were now in my hands. The same company from which I was thrown out just days ago, now, I was a major stakeholder. The boardroom was in chaos. Some members were furiously discussing what this meant, while others simply sat in stunned silence. But the one person who looked completely destroyed was the so-called new boss. His hands trembled as he looked between me and his father, his face a picture of sheer panic. This can't be happening," he stammered. "Dad, do something." But his father just glared at him, disappointment clear in his eyes. "You brought this upon yourself." His voice was cold, his anger now simmering into disgust. The employees, who had been watching from the sidelines, began whispering among themselves. I could hear the hushed voices. "She deserved better. He was always arrogant, treating us like trash. I hope she takes over completely. The tension was unbearable for him. I could see the sweat forming on his forehead, the way he swallowed hard, trying to think of a way out. And then, he turned to me. His entitled smirk was gone, replaced by a desperate, almost pathetic expression. His lips quivered as he folded his hands together in a pleading gesture. "Listen," he said, his voice shaking, I made a mistake, okay? I didn't know about the contract. I was just trying to prove myself." I raised an eyebrow. "Prove yourself? By firing the one person who actually knew how to run things?" He flinched. He had no answer to that. His arrogance had blinded him, and now the weight of his failure was pressing down on him. "Please," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't do this. We can work something out. I'll even give you your job back." I let out a soft laugh. Now, he was begging me for mercy. Before I could respond, one of the board members spoke up. "Actually," the older man said, adjusting his glasses, "we've been watching how you've handled things these past few days, and frankly, you've done nothing but damage control for your own mistakes." Another board member nodded. "If anything, we believe the company would be better off without you." I turned to look at the employees gathered outside the glass doors. Some of them had pressed their hands against the glass, eagerly watching how the tables had turned. When they saw me looking, they began nodding in encouragement. They were on my side. I slowly turned back to him, my expression unreadable. "You said the company doesn't need liabilities, right?" I reminded him, echoing his own cruel words from the day he fired me. His face went completely white. He knew what was coming next. "Well," I continued, leaning in slightly, "I think the board just made it clear who the real liability is." A deep silence filled the room. And then, his father spoke, his voice firm. "Son," he said, standing tall. "You're fired." News of his downfall spread like wildfire. The company's stocks plummeted, investors began pulling out, and within days, the media was ripping him apart. He fired the wrong person. Arrogance destroyed the company. From CEO to laughingstock, how one mistake cost him everything. The same employees who once forced fake smiles in front of him now openly mocked him behind his back. The respect he had demanded was now replaced with ridicule. He tried desperately to fix things. He begged his father to give him another chance. "Dad, please," he pleaded. I can turn this around." But his father wasn't listening. His jaw was clenched, his face filled with disgust. "I never thought you would become this reckless," he spat. "Because of your one foolish mistake, the company has fallen into crisis." The humiliation didn't stop there. The very people who used to flatter him, who laughed at his bad jokes and praised his every word, now wanted nothing to do with him. I watched as former allies ignored his calls, former friends distanced themselves, and former supporters pretended he didn't exist. And then, he made his biggest mistake. He walked up to me, desperation in his eyes. The arrogance was completely gone. I was wrong," he stuttered. "I made a mistake. You were always the real backbone of this company. If you come back, I'll even step down. Just help fix this mess." I tilted my head, pretending to think about it. "Oh, you mean the mess you created after calling me a liability?" He flinched, his face burning red with shame. I let out a small laugh. "Karma works fast, doesn't it?" At that moment, the board members entered, discussing something serious. His father's voice was cold as he looked at me. "I want to officially offer you a position on the board," he said. I smirked. That was it. The final nail in the coffin. The son's face drained of all color. This was the moment he truly realized he had lost everything. The final board meeting was held in the same grand conference room where he once stood proudly, mocking me in front of everyone. But today, the tables had completely turned. His father sat at the head of the table, his face hard as stone. The other board members exchanged glances, some looking disappointed, others frustrated. The air was thick with tension. "We've reached a decision," his father announced, his voice cold and firm. He looked around, then took a deep breath before saying the words that would shatter his son's world. "Effective immediately, you are being removed as CEO." The room fell silent. For the first time, the once arrogant man had no words. His hands gripped the table, knuckles turning white. What? He stammered, eyes darting around the room, searching for support. But there was none. This isn't fair, he yelled, slamming his fist on the table. I did everything I could. You can't do this to me. His father's gaze didn't waver. No, you did everything wrong. One by one, the board members nodded in agreement. The vote was unanimous. I sat across from him, watching the panic and disbelief on his face. It was over. As the meeting ended, I stood up, smoothing my blazer. With measured steps, I walked toward the door, the same door he had proudly forced me out of. But this time, I was the one walking away with power. Before stepping out, I turned back slightly, giving him one last look. You were right about one thing, I said, my voice calm but cutting. This company doesn't need liabilities. His face turned pale. I walked out with confidence, leaving him behind, broken, defeated, and powerless. Time had finally given me what I truly deserved. Sitting in my new corner office, I glanced at the skyline through the massive glass windows. The company was now mine, not just in title but in power. I was the major shareholder, the decision maker, the one truly in control. The same people who once hesitated to acknowledge me now stood in respect. Employees who had seen me humiliated that day now worked under my leadership. The boardroom that once echoed with his mockery now resonated with my decisions. And him? He was nothing more than a fallen prince. News spread fast, how the arrogant son had been thrown out of his own empire. Job rejections followed one after another. No company wanted to touch him. His name had become synonymous with failure and recklessness. I heard from an old colleague that he was desperately job hunting, knocking on doors that refused to open for him. The same man who laughed at me now found himself laughed at by the world. Karma had worked perfectly. One evening, at an exclusive corporate event, I spotted him standing awkwardly near the entrance, out of place, ignored, invisible. He looked smaller, defeated, a shadow of the man he used to be. He met my gaze, and for a moment, I saw regret and desperation. He took a hesitant step forward, as if about to say something, maybe an apology, maybe a plea. But I simply smirked, took a sip of my champagne, and said the words that ended it all. Always read the contract. His face fell, his shoulders slumped, and as I turned away, I knew he had finally learned his lesson. As I walked out of the building, I glanced back one last time. He was still standing there, restless and humiliated. No one was paying him any attention. The same people who once bowed to him now avoided even looking his way. Stepping into my luxury car, a small smirk appeared on my face. I had won, not just in business but in proving a point. Justice had been served, and karma had played its role. He thought I was weak, but today, he learned that true power doesn't come from status, it comes from intelligence. Life has a way of turning tables when you least expect it. Always remember, arrogance leads to downfall, and the one you underestimate today might be the one you answer to tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Do you believe in karma? Comment below and share your thoughts.